Hello, and welcome to Juliet and Lucy's Quiet Leadership Revolution, the podcast for senior and aspiring leaders who want to make their voice heard and their impact felt through thoughtful, reflective, confident leadership. I'm Juliet Corbett, an executive coach and strategist, and I work one-to-one with senior leaders, guiding them to find their strategic focus, empower their teams, and regain control over their time.
And I'm Lucy Gower. I'm a facilitator, trainer and coach, and I empower leaders to build their happy, confident and high-performing teams. I'm excited today because we're talking about a topic that has been brought to us by you, one of our listeners, and today we're going to be talking about a real knotty question, I think, about how to show up in vulnerability as a leader. Juliet, where do we start with this? I think it's about why do we even care about being vulnerable or not? What are we even talking about here, perhaps, is our starting point.
Yeah, let's start there and see where we go. So I think the old-fashioned way of thinking about leadership as the kind of the strong, charismatic leader who, never shows any form of weakness, would lead us to think that any form of vulnerability is to be avoided as a leader. But what we know is that that's quite an outdated, if ever it was actually particularly successful, method of leading either an organization or a team. So what we know instead is that actually being human, showing our humanness, and therefore sometimes showing our vulnerability is a really great way to lead an organization or a team, because we're building trust, and trust is like that really essential piece of elastic almost that keeps a team together, keeps an organization together. Without it, everything starts to just fall apart and everyone's heading off in different directions. So the way I see it is vulnerability is essential to show as a leadership, but there's a big question about how much and when and to whom and what to share.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yes, I agree. If I think about lots of the things that we talk about in this podcast and our view of leadership about, together you are inspiring and leading a team to make an impact. And that doesn't happen based on what we know about human behavior and how we're motivated, how learning ourselves is really important, being told what to do versus being told working with somebody else to achieve a shared goal is really different. And if I think about leaders that don't show any vulnerability and are expected to know all of the answers and just kind of give instruction, that is almost the total opposite of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And we're all human beings, and we might sit on different might have different set of values, different set of beliefs, different communication styles, but always it's about human to human, and part of being human is learning by mistakes and perhaps feeling vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever done that, you'll know what that feeling feels like in the pit of your stomach, and you have an instant fight, flight, freeze response. Can I get away with it if I don't tell anybody? Will anyone find out? Or do I need to kind of talk about what's happened? And I suppose that stomach clenching feeling is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about vulnerability. And then vulnerability in leadership, if you are leading people and in the back of your mind you're thinking, I need to be a good role model, those feelings can be at odds with each other, even though actually when you're rational about it, you know that it's not.
Yeah. What came to mind for me actually was thinking back to some of the leaders that have had the most positive impact on me, and they are 100% leaders who have shown their humanness. And I love your description of vulnerability as something that we physically feel. That's going to be different for everybody. We're not assuming that everyone's going to feel that the same way, but there often is that physical sort of, oh my goodness, what's going to happen next, sort of clenched feeling that happens. And the best leaders that I've worked with are the ones where that they felt that because they've articulated it in a way that's built trust, that's built a sense of we're in this together, built a sense of psychological safety for everybody around them, but not in any way felt like a weakness or a panic response in those leaders. They've managed that emotional feeling and then articulated in a way that builds a sense of them as a human. They don't have all the answers, and their capability to lead us through this situation.
Yes. So there's a massive thing there around trust. And there's something in there around, that feeling like your stomach clenches, you might feel a little bit sick. I need, like, you're feeling really vulnerable about maybe your own capability, your own leadership style, and being able to work through that to show it. But I think it's really interesting what you said about being able to show it in a way that makes you feel that you are capable and you're leading well, and not showing it in the moment where you feel like you're going to be sick because you feel so
Yeah,
vulnerable. I'm not saying that's a right or a wrong. And I think with this
yeah,
topic, I feel like as I'm speaking, I'm unraveling what I think about it to an extent. But I think it comes down to competence and trust. So if you've something's
yeah,
happened, you're feeling really vulnerable and you work through it, and then you talk about it. It's a very, very different feeling to feeling vulnerable and telling people about it in the moment. And I'm not saying that there's a
yeah,
wrong there, because we're all different and the relationships you have with your team is different. But I think it's worth acknowledging that's two different styles and ways of leading by example, depending on which
yeah.
you
So,
experience.
Lucy, I think we're going to own up to the audience. You and I both did some research before this episode because we knew we wanted to cover this because it was a listener topic. We both said there's got to be something out there. We kind of got a feeling of what we think. Maybe there's something out there in the research. And both of us found different elements of research that did support what we're going to be sharing with you, but there isn't a one answer out there. So I think maybe rather than us having to say it all the way through this episode, it's almost like everything we say today is, and it might be different for other people. We're going to speak to this maybe from our own experience or the way we feel and think about this topic. But maybe just to flag up right at the beginning here, this is one of those ones where we definitely want feedback because if we're missing something that feels different to you as you're listening, we want to
Yeah,
hear about
absolutely.
it. I'm being vulnerable in saying that, Lucy. How are you feeling about saying that out to our
I
lovely
love
listener?
that you've done that, Julie. Um, yeah, I agree. I think when I was starting to unpick this, it opened a massive worm can, to be honest, because the answer that I want to come to on this podcast is, how do we know how vulnerable to be? And how do we deliver that? And Juliet and I together, as we've been researching and talking about this, haven't come up with a blueprint or a single
Yeah,
answer. So talking about our experiences in the hope that there'll be some penny drop moments for us, and hopefully you as you're listening, is how we're going to proceed with
yeah.
this one.
I think that's good. The way it feels to me is we can talk through some various different dimensions of
Mm,
this. And at the end of the day, if you're navigating a decision that's live for you now as you listen about how much vulnerability to show, listen to the various different kind of dimensions that we're talking about. But at the end of the day, probably there's an intuition that you're going to feel deep down. And that's probably a great place to start, is following that intuition as to what to do next.
yeah,
Um, so I think that element of trust and capability is one of those really key dimensions that
yes.
we've already identified.
So I think there's something there that we've talked about in other episodes about, if you're leading a team, how you build a environment of psychological safety where people feel safe to fail, where whatever ideas you suggest, you know that you're going to be met with respect and a listening ear. And that isn't about a leader creating an environment and everybody else doing it. It's about the environment that the leader is in also. And so being human, sharing some of the ups and downs, and putting in that groundwork, if you like, for a time when you feel vulnerable and you know that when you trust people, you can be more yourself with them. It's really,
Yeah.
it makes some of the other things that we've talked about even more in the spotlight because you're creating that environment where it's safe to be vulnerable with others.
Yeah. So I think that's a process that happens over time, isn't it? So that trust almost happens by sharing a little bit of something vulnerable and then a little bit more next time and then slowly building up. And depending on the dynamic that you have with those that you're leading, that might be reciprocal as well. So there's a little bit of sharing at each stage of developing that trusting relationship. So it's sort of a gradual process of creating that trust.
Agreed. And things like not always just focusing in on the work, asking people how they're doing. If someone has told you something about their life, that you check in, did you have a nice birthday? How's your mum doing? Those sorts of
Mhm.
things that actually for the vast majority of us are just like how we operate. That's us just being human. But I think sometimes when we're
Yeah,
really busy, that can get in the way and we stop doing that. And I think that then people can come a little bit more distant and you can lose some of that trust. So I think it's even when you're juggling lots of things, you're feeling overwhelmed and busy, it's even more important to connect with others and remember to ask and think about how you feel when someone's remembered it was your birthday or remembered something that you said to them. That fast tracks that trust.
yeah. It does, doesn't it? And actually, I had a little Venn diagram that came into my mind as you said that. So the whole kind of area of humanness includes like remembering it was their birthday, asking how their weekend was, asking after a parent who you know is ill or something like that. That's the whole area of humanness, and that develops trust because you're talking to them as a human, not just as a member of your team in terms of a work context. And then showing a vulnerability might be a subsection of that, a subset of being human is feeling vulnerability, feeling vulnerable, and then occasionally, when appropriate, sharing that vulnerability with others. So you build the trust through all of those, not just sharing vulnerability.
Exactly, agreed. And then I suppose there's something about, vulnerability of its essence. You don't know how, like you feel vulnerable, you're going to say something and you don't know
Mhm.
how that's going to be perceived. That's the vulnerability bit. If you knew that what you were going to say was going to be 100% was going to be met in a good way, you wouldn't feel vulnerable. But I suppose the level of trust. So I love a Venn diagram, but I've got a matrix in my mind now. But there's something around the level of trust equates to how much you feel that you're able to share. So the bigger the
Yeah.
trust that you've already got established, the more likely you are to feel to share vulnerability that it's going to be met well. But you're never going to really
Yeah.
know because if you knew, you wouldn't feel vulnerable. If you knew for certain, you wouldn't feel vulnerable.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely. Definitely.
So that makes me think about we're talking about how you show vulnerability as a leader, and a massive part of that is the work that you've done with your team to build trust. But that's how you respond to your leader's vulnerability as part of their team, which is a give and take relationship.
Yes. Yes. I mean, we're a group of humans working towards a shared goal. So there is that give and take element. And I think the leader's role is to create an environment in which they're not just role modeling, showing vulnerability within the boundaries that they feel are appropriate. They're actually role modeling how we respond to others' vulnerability as
Yes.
well, and how we support and how we show um, openness to the different ways that people are going to share that, knowing that what someone is has taken all their courage to share with you and feels you can almost feel the energy in their body as they're taking that courage into their hands and sharing with you as the leader of
Mm,
vulnerability. You might not necessarily understand from personal experience why they feel vulnerable about that. I'll be like, yeah, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But to understand with empathy, actually, for different people, it will feel more nerve-wracking and more courageous to share different elements depending on where they feel. Well, it kind of comes back to Brené Brown's work around shame, doesn't it? Where they feel like there might be some uncertainty in how it's going to be received, and therefore potentially some shame in terms of the way that we are showing our capability in work, potentially.
yeah, I agree. I think there's something there when you talk about empathy. What I see happen sometimes is that someone might share something and be vulnerable, and the other person is so keen to make them feel that it's okay. They'll share their bigger vulnerability thing as a way to show empathy and go, we're
Yeah,
in it together. But actually, what I see when that happens is that the person who shared first feels um, like they haven't been listened to, or that their problems are not that significant because you've kind of top trumped them with your bigger thing.
yeah,
So I think there's something within that, like we're all different about what's vulnerable for us and what's safe to share, and the context in which we're sharing makes a difference as well. But there's something around, you don't need to fix it or you don't need to make someone feel better. It's just about listening and being supportive to what they need in that moment. And sometimes
yeah,
that can just be sitting in silence with them.
yeah, yeah,
And I think the
definitely.
nature of this, it's so hard to give a blueprint of here's what you do. It's back to what you
Yeah,
said at the very beginning. It's about an intuition, it's about a gut feeling.
yeah,
And if you need any
yeah,
gut feeling guidance, it's about what would a good human being, that's not quite the right words I wanted, but like what's my human response to that? Not as a leader, a manager, or
yeah,
someone in a team. What's my human response on the most basic?
yeah. And maybe as you shared that, the kind of checklist that comes is what's my human response to this? It's to give some time and attention to what's being shared with me as a vulnerability that someone's sharing. But then there's also something about I'm going to dial down my any kind of self-serving or self-focus in this conversation because this isn't about me. This is the other person sharing a vulnerability. This is me being quite quiet, me really listening, um, and it's not about me telling a story which trumps their story to make them feel better. It's curious, isn't it? That does seem to be baked into human nature, and yet it's really
Yeah.
counterproductive. Um, it is actually just about really focusing on them in that moment and what they need. So it's humanness combined with an outward focus, potentially.
And I think it's maybe as simple as being kind and holding
Yeah,
space.
yeah, yeah,
And that builds trust and is a two-way street. As you were
definitely.
as you were talking, I was thinking about kind of flipping this to being a person in a team where your leader doesn't show vulnerability and the impact of that. I don't know
Mhm.
if you've had any experience,
Yeah,
thoughts.
yeah. The word kind of robotic is the word that comes to mind. Sort of, it's sort of, you can have a leader. Yeah, and someone immediately springs to mind for me. I'm not going to share any details. I don't want to in any way enable them to be identified. But in the case I'm thinking of, incredibly capable, incredibly intelligent in all respects, other than showing some emotion and humanness, ticks all the boxes as to what you'd require from a leader. But in an absence of that kind of humanness, vulnerability, emotion, that was all really absent. I'm sure it was there behind the scenes, but it was absent in the way that they were showing themselves to the rest of the team. And it doesn't really inspire, well, actually, in my case, it probably didn't inspire me or other team members to necessarily share anything about what we thought we could do better, or it didn't provide a kind of a psychological safety for us to admit to something that didn't quite go to plan, or that we'd forgotten to do, to put it frankly. And so it led to everyone just sort of turning up, doing their job, and going home again. And it wasn't particularly inspiring place to be, or particularly productive as a team. We weren't more than the component of our parts. We were just individuals working towards goals.
The leader sets the tone and the leader sets the culture. The
Of
leader's
course.
energy can ripple through a team.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah, definitely.
when I've had an experience of somebody not opening up and sharing when they had a lot of things that they were struggling with, the rest of the team felt very let down and
Mm,
sad that don't you trust us enough to let us help you? It comes back
yeah.
to trust. Like we can feel if we're vulnerable, do we trust people enough to hold that vulnerability for us and support us? But if we don't trust people with that, they might feel that there's a lack of trust, which can erode it. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't, basically. And it's that sweet spot
Yeah.
that is absolutely trial and error.
Yeah. And it changes over time just to make it even harder. So it's kind of how much to share, but then it's also how to share it and when to share it. And there's so many different elements to this. So it's not surprising we didn't have a blueprint answer for you. Um, there's one other really important area that I don't know. I'm going to test out here with you whether you think this is important because I've got an example for me, and in fact, this is a pattern probably for me. I would hesitate to show vulnerability in a way that calls into question my capability. So a lot of my values, a lot of my identity is kind of rooted in doing a really solid, good job. And so for me, thinking back, and there's one example where I showed vulnerability in asking for a sabbatical from a leadership role that I was in. And I was really honest in saying the reason I need this because I'm not at my full resilience. My mental health is currently okay, but I can feel that that will be challenged if I continue to work at the pace that I'm working at. I need, I think it was 2 months, 3 months maybe, that I asked for as a sabbatical from this job in order to perform at my peak performance. I'm just not there at the moment. I'm not doing what I know I can do. That took an enormous amount of courage. I mean, I could have made up a pretend reason why I wanted a sabbatical, but I didn't. I went in with honesty, one to one with my manager. But what I knew in that situation was I framed what I was saying as it's not because I'm not coping, although to be completely honest, I wasn't. It actually was important to me to be framing it as I'm currently operating below my full capability because of these other things that are happening, some of them outside of work, life circumstances. As a result, by allowing me to take this time to recoup my energy, my enthusiasm, and come back, you will then see me working at my peak capacity. And what was really interesting to me was firstly reflecting on why I felt it so important to frame it that way. I think it's something to do with my values and the importance of my capability being recognized. It was also really important to me that kind of 6 months after I came back, the head of the organization said to me, "You are absolutely right. I have now seen you working at peak performance, and you were not at peak performance previously," because she'd come in since I'd, as a new leader, since I'd been struggling a little bit. And so for me, there's something in here. It's obviously trust, yes, but there's something about showing vulnerability in a way that doesn't call into question the core competence that you bring to a role. Now, Lucy, you need to tell me, this is almost like a coaching session here that you're listening to, dear listener. But you need to tell me, does that feel like that might just be me and the values that I'm rooted in, the way things feel to me? Or might there be something slightly more universal in that?
Yes and no. Two things can be true at once. So I know
Of course.
you and I think this is absolutely the strategic approach that you take. So that makes absolutely sense on a personal, I know you basis. And I also think that many people will have values around being competent.
Mm,
But I think what you've talked about is exactly the essence of vulnerability. So you, for reasons based on your values, couldn't be 100% vulnerable. You couldn't go to this person and say, I'm feeling like my mental health is doing really badly. I need to step back for a few months in order that I can get myself back to my A game. You
mhm,
presented it in a way that was utterly connected back to your values. And perhaps that's what all of
mm,
us do. Many of us will have a value about competence. Many of us have values about being good at what we do or being capable, or like there's lots of different words that we might use. And I think it does come back to something that you mentioned earlier, that if we're not living our values, there's a disconnect. And in the case of vulnerability, I think it comes back to I feel a bit ashamed that I can't do what is really important to me, or I can't operate in a way that's really important to me. And that's perhaps the crux of why we feel vulnerable. Somebody else who doesn't have the same value set, and there's no judgment here for me on what values you do or don't have, may not feel that. They might not feel vulnerable to say, do you know what, when mental health is really bad, I need to take a step back. But there might be
Yeah.
something else in that message for them that makes them feel vulnerable, that they're not able to support their family properly. Ugh. So yes and no,
Yeah.
my short
So
answer.
So this is, Lucy, why you are an excellent coach. And this is why even coaches need a coach, because I had not spotted that. And I talked to loads of my clients about values and the importance of understanding when we have an emotional response to something, it's often because our values are intentional, being kind of conflicted by someone else's actions. But you are, of course, 100% right. And so actually that might be a really interesting area to think about as you're listening to this, dear listener. Even if we can't give you the blueprint answer, maybe thinking about what are your core values, and if you don't know those, there are other resources out there. Maybe Lucy and I, we can link to some
Yes.
things that we've got available around values, um, which can then help you to understand through that prism, if you like, of that
Yeah.
set of values, which will be pretty much unique to you, that combination. What is it about this particular area of vulnerability you're questioning how much to share? What is it that feels important? And therefore, your intuition will start to give you a sense of, okay, this is what feels good. This is what my boundary is as to where I don't share.
Yes. I've started to draw.
I love we're doing this live, Lucy. This is good.
Yeah. I started to do a Venn diagram as you were talking, Juliet. So if we
Good.
go back to our, did I ever mention how much I love Venn diagrams?
You have a number of times. It's all good. We're in the same ballpark on that one.
Do you know Mr. Venn lived in Hull?
I did
No,
not.
anyway,
Maybe that you can pay a homage to
I've done
his
it.
old
I've done it.
house.
I've
Okay.
been to, anyway, right,
You're
I'm
serious.
serious.
That's another conversation. Okay, good.
Right. So if this topic today that we're talking about is how to show up in vulnerability as a leader, some of the things that you just said there, Juliet, had a real light bulb moment for me. So I think there's something around if you are leading a team and thinking about, how vulnerable do I be? There's so much going on. I think what I've started to write down is like, why is it that you're feeling vulnerable? Can you unpick that a little bit? What are your values? Is it linked to that? Maybe it's to do with beliefs or some of the limiting beliefs. And what's the context in which you're operating in? How high is your team trust, the trust that you hold with your team? What does that culture look like? And your gut feeling, that is the kind of things to think about in terms of how much
Yeah.
do I share. And then the last thing that I've jotted down here as you were talking, Juliet, so thank you for sort of getting my brain working. I think there might be a question that can be helpful in that moment of what if I do share this? How will I feel and what will happen? And what if I don't? How will I feel and what might happen? And that's kind of some
Yeah.
questions to ask to figure out how do I show up in vulnerability as a leader? That's what
I
I'm up
love that.
to.
That's a really great list of questions. Really great. I'm sure it's nested in there somewhere. There's one other thing that I feel might be
Mm.
important, which is to do with how raw it feels. So some forms of vulnerability, I think any form of vulnerability is going to involve some emotion, but some will be more emotional than others.
I,
And something that feels really raw needs to be processed maybe before
yes, I agree. I agree.
asking that sort of questions.
I think there might be something about recency in.
Yes. And recency isn't just a has X days or months passed. Recency is to do with how current the emotional feelings are. There's a really horrible phrase. I don't really like the phrase. It conjures up all sorts of unhelpful images. But there's a saying that I hear quite a lot from different places, which is share from the scar and not from the wound.
Yeah.
I think it comes from Brené Brown's work, kind of sharing what you've processed. So the scar has formed over the things you've already processed, whether that's to do with something, really significant that happened in your childhood or something more recent that's happened. And you may receive, you may find coaching or therapy helpful to help process that experience. But if you're sharing from something that you're right in the middle of it, it's almost like the wound. You're sharing from the wound now. I don't think that's impossible. I think you can share from now, but it's just important to really think through it, maybe with even more care, that sort of questions that you articulated there, because it's possible for that to go slightly, it feels slightly more raw as you're sharing it. And so your self-control might be slightly lower as you're sharing that particular vulnerability.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. There's something around share from the scar when you're ready to with your team,
Yeah,
and share from the wound with your therapist, counselor, trusted
yeah,
friend, because sometimes we need a little bit of help to unpick the emotions that are going on for us to be able
yeah,
to see a way forward.
yeah. And equally, not to put any pressure on people, but sometimes sharing from our historical experiences is really beneficial if we're role modeling leadership to other kind of younger generations coming up, because actually for others to understand that even really successful leaders have been through all sorts of different experiences in their life and have had times where they've really struggled, and that that's okay to talk about, but at the same time not to feel that you have to talk about anything in your past or your history. You don't have to, but sometimes it can be really like a service to the world almost to be able to share something that's really healed, that you've really processed and come through the other
Yeah,
side.
I agree. With a caveat that
Mm.
it's not when someone's told you about their difficult thing and you say, wow, when I was your age, this, and this, and do a top trump on them. I
Yes,
hope people know trumps is that
agreed.
game, and I'm not
Timing.
referring to a certain.
I think top trumps
I
is
hope so.
pretty
Yeah, we need to
universal.
check.
I don't know. We'll have to do a quick look, and some of our US listeners might let us know if that's top trumps. Is that a card game that you played? Maybe
Definitely
not.
was a card game I played. Anyway,
Yeah. Is there anything? Well, I'm sure there are things we haven't touched on. Is there anything really important that you're feeling that we haven't touched on in this topic?
I feel that we've done our best job at starting to talk through this with acknowledging that we didn't come with any answers, but we just thought that through talking it through, we might be able to help. And I think that my thing is that it's really different. Like this is we're dealing with emotions, context, things that are so personal to each and every one of us that it's a really tough topic. But the thing that's driving is that, this is called the Quiet Leadership Revolution. This podcast is all about providing help and support to help you if you're a new or aspiring leader. And I 100% believe fundamentally that human beings work with other human beings, and we have to be human beings, not human doings, I suppose, for one of them. And to be able
Mm,
to find your groove, to share your whole self. That sounds like a cheesy thing to say, but you bring all of us bring so much if we can just relax into being ourselves. And part of being a human is having vulnerabilities and creating an environment
yeah,
where it's safe for ourselves and for people who work with us to do that is fundamental to good leadership.
yeah.
Juliet, what's your thoughts?
No, I think that's great. I'm going to put you on the spot. Are you able to recap that list of questions that
Yes,
you
because
created spontaneously? I just feel like that would be a useful way for us to
sure.
wrap up
Is it
our
because it's
conversation.
in a Venn diagram? Yes.
Excellent. Good, good, good.
So the things that I talked about earlier is um, in that point about whether we're deciding to show up in vulnerability as a leader, is thinking about why we're feeling vulnerable, and whether that's on your own or with somebody else, talking through um, what's happened and thinking about what are my values. Do I know what my values are? And if I do, what indicators do they give as to why this is feeling vulnerable for me? It's perhaps thinking about some of our own beliefs and what our limiting beliefs might be. Well, what are the things that are sort of we fundamentally believe we can't do? That what are the beliefs that are getting in our way? So it might a limiting belief might be if I'm vulnerable, then people won't think I'm capable. And for example, so working through that either on your own or with a trusted person, what does the team and trust environment look like? So how psychologically safe do you feel in the team? Um, and yeah, how safe do you feel and how safe do they feel? Juliet, to your point, what is the rawness of that emotion and feeling about your vulnerability? What's the recency? But that might also look like, what does that look like in terms of your own emotions, no matter how much amount of time has passed. And then there was a couple of questions that, again, might be helpful to work through. It's like, what if I do share this in these words? What might happen? What might the outcome be? And what if I don't? What might the outcome be? And sometimes that what if I don't question can be really insightful. If you're thinking, what if I don't? Well, I don't tell anybody, and then nobody properly understands me as a human being, and that's going to have a bigger impact. Yeah, so that's what I wrote down.
I think that's very thorough. Fantastic. I think we wrap up there. But in all seriousness, we want feedback on this
Yeah.
one. This came from a listener question, and any other questions that you've got, especially those that get us thinking, that get us kind of really get the juices flowing, really, really welcome. Anything that we haven't covered. Quite a few of the questions we're getting are around, well, you talked about something to do with this in one of your episodes, but actually my question's slightly different. So any questions like that, fire them through to us, and our contact details are in the episode notes. And also any feedback on what we've talked about today in terms of what's landed, what we might have missed, other contexts or other situations that maybe we haven't considered and talked about today. And we can always revisit, can't we, Lucy, in another episode? So yeah, perfect. So I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I'm Juliet Corbett, an executive coach and strategist working one-to-one with senior leaders.
And I'm Lucy Gower, a facilitator, trainer, and coach helping leaders develop their high performing teams. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with colleagues and help leverage the impact of the quiet leadership revolution.